Santa Fe, New Mexico, stirred awake under a hesitant sunrise. But an unsettling silence clung to the air, thicker than the high desert chill. In the upscale neighborhood nestled against the foothills of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, stood the sprawling adobe-style mansion that had become Gene Hackman's sanctuary. The legendary actor, retired from the silver screen, had sought refuge here with his wife, Betsy Arakawa, hoping to escape the relentless glare of Hollywood. But this morning, the serenity of their retreat was about to shatter. Miguel, the Hackman's longtime gardener, arrived for his routine visit. The gate, usually secured, stood ajar, creaking softly in the wind. He frowned, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. The two dogs, a pair of golden retrievers, bounded towards him, their usual enthusiastic greeting replaced with a frantic, almost desperate energy. He noticed the front door was slightly open, an unthinkable breach of security for the reclusive couple. He called out, "Mr. Hackman? Mrs. Arakawa?" Only the wind whispered back, his heart hammering against his ribs. Miguel cautiously pushed the door open wider. The air inside was heavy, stagnant. A faint, cloying odor hung in the air, a scent he couldn't quite place. The silence was deafening, broken only by the anxious whimpers of the dogs. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through him. He stumbled back, grabbing his phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed 911. "Something's wrong," he stammered into the phone, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something's terribly wrong at the Hackman residence." The dispatcher's calm voice crackled through the speaker. But Miguel barely heard it. He knew, with a sickening certainty, that the quiet haven of Gene Hackman was now a scene of unimaginable tragedy. The legend, it seemed, had finally met his match. Not on the battlefield of Hollywood, but in the shadowed corners of his own home. Detective Isabella, Izzy, Martinez, Santa Fe Police Department's lead investigator, arrived at the Hackman mansion, the flashing lights of the patrol cars painting stark shadows across the adobe walls. A seasoned detective with a sharp mind and an even sharper intuition. Izzy had seen her share of death, but something about this case sent a chill down her spine. Perhaps it was the celebrity involved, or maybe the oppressive silence that clung to the property, heavy with unspoken secrets. As she stepped inside, the reality of the scene hit her with full force. The air was thick with the acrid smell of decay, and the house felt strangely still. Forensics teams were already swarming the scene, meticulously documenting every detail. She found herself strangely captivated by the photos of Gene Hackman on the walls, a reminder of the actor's powerful presence. Now extinguished, Izzy herself had been a huge fan, growing up watching his films, captivated by his ability to inhabit such diverse and complex characters. She interviewed Miguel, whose grief and bewilderment were palpable. He described the Hackmans as private but kind, always respectful. She spoke to neighbors, gleaning snippets of information about the couple's quiet life, their occasional walks in the mountains, their infrequent trips to town. Then, examining the scene, she noticed a small framed photograph on a bedside table. It was an older picture, faded and worn, depicting a younger Gene Hackman with a woman who wasn't Betsy. It was Faye Malt, his first wife, and a significant portion of the photograph was torn away, leaving behind a jagged edge that hinted at violence, both literal and emotional. A cold feeling settled in Izzy's stomach. This wasn't just a tragedy, it was a puzzle box, filled with ghosts of the past, and she was determined to unlock its secrets. The idyllic image of Gene Hackman and Betsy Arakawa's marriage, carefully curated over the years, began to crumble under Izzy's scrutiny. To understand the present, she needed to delve into the past, to understand the dynamics of their relationship, the unspoken tensions that might have simmered beneath the surface. Betsy, a woman of Japanese descent, had been a calming influence in Hackman's life after his tumultuous divorce from Faye. But as the years passed, the age gap between them became more apparent. Gene, struggling with his declining health and retirement, had withdrawn into himself, his legendary intensity now channeled into a quiet, almost brooding silence. Betsy, once a vibrant and independent woman, found herself increasingly isolated, her own dreams and ambitions sacrificed for the sake of her husband's well-being. He was a good man, a close friend of Betsy confided in Izzy, but he was a difficult man. His mind was always somewhere else. lost in his memories, his regrets. The conversation painted a picture of growing loneliness, of a woman who felt increasingly invisible in the shadow of a legend. She began to drink more, relying on prescription medication to cope with anxiety and insomnia. One evening, a heated argument erupted between them, overheard by the housekeeper. "You never talk to me anymore," Betsy had shouted, her voice trembling with emotion. "You treat me like a ghost. I'm tired of living in your shadow." The words hung heavy in the air, a testament to the growing chasm between them. The facade of happiness, it seemed, had been concealing a deep and festering wound. The torn photograph became Izzy's obsession. It led her to Elizabeth, Gene Hackman's daughter from his first marriage. Elizabeth, now a successful author, lived a quiet life in a nearby town. She appeared genuinely grief-stricken by her father's death. But Izzy sensed a carefully constructed reserve, a wall erected to protect her own fragile emotions. During the interview, Elizabeth spoke fondly of her father, but her words were measured, her eyes guarded. She acknowledged the tumultuous relationship between her parents, the bitterness that lingered long after their divorce. "My mother never truly forgave him," Elizabeth admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. She felt cheated, robbed of her best years. Izzy pressed her about the torn photograph. Elizabeth hesitated, then sighed. "That photograph. My mother was obsessed with it. She believed my father had been unfaithful, that there was another woman, another child." Izzy's ears perked up. "Another child?" Elizabeth nodded, her expression troubled. "It was just a rumor. A whisper passed down through the family. My mother always suspected it, but she never had any proof. It drove her mad, that uncertainty." A dark seed of suspicion began to sprout in Izzy's mind. The Hackman mansion was not just a crime scene, it was a repository of secrets. A web of lies and betrayals spun over decades. And at the center of that web lay the ghost of a child. A child Gene Hackman had never acknowledged. This was no longer just about a double suicide, it was about a family shattered by secrets. A family consumed by the ghosts of the past. To understand the roots of the Hackman family's dysfunction, Izzy needed to rewind the clock, to revisit the era of Gene Hackman's meteoric rise to fame. The 1970s were a crucible of ambition and temptation, and Hollywood was a glittering minefield, littered with broken dreams and shattered lives. Gene Hackman, a relatively late bloomer in the acting world, had been thrust into the spotlight with his Oscar-winning performance in The French Connection. The sudden fame and adoration were intoxicating, but they also came with a price. The relentless demands of his career took a toll on his marriage to Faye, their already strained relationship buckling under the pressure. He found himself drawn to the allure of younger women, seduced by the attention and admiration they lavished upon him. One actress in particular, a rising starlet with a fiery spirit and a ruthless ambition, caught his eye. They embarked on a torrid affair, a clandestine romance fueled by passion and recklessness. The affair was a closely guarded secret. But in the gossipy world of Hollywood, nothing stays hidden forever. A tabloid photographer caught them in a compromising position and threatened to expose their relationship, demanding a hefty sum to keep the story out of the headlines. Gene was faced with a devastating choice: confess to his wife and risk destroying his marriage, or pay the photographer and live with the burden of his betrayal. He chose the latter, buying his silence with a substantial amount of money. But the damage was done. The trust between Gene and Faye was irrevocably broken, and their marriage was slowly dying, poisoned by secrets and lies. Izzy pored over Betsy Arakawa's diaries, hoping to find a clue, a confession, anything that could shed light on the events leading up to her death. The diaries, filled with elegant Japanese calligraphy interspersed with English entries, offered a poignant glimpse into Betsy's inner world. She wrote about her love for Gene, her admiration for his talent, and her unwavering support for his career. But as she read further, a darker undercurrent began to emerge. Betsy wrote about feeling increasingly isolated, about Gene's growing detachment, about the loneliness that gnawed at her soul. She spoke of her fears for his health, his heart condition, and the constant worry that consumed her. "He is so strong, so stubborn," she wrote, "but I see him fading, like a star slowly dimming in the night sky." She also confided her suspicions about Gene's past, the rumors that haunted their marriage. "Sometimes," she wrote, "I feel like I am living in the shadow of another woman. A woman I can never compete with. A ghost that will never leave us. Then, Izzy found it. A page ripped out, torn with a violence that mirrored the torn photograph. Only a few fragments remained. M. Co. 500N. Mexico. The fragments were like pieces of a shattered mirror reflecting only distorted glimpses of the truth. M. Co. Could it be Marco? The child Elizabeth had mentioned? 500. Was it a payment? Blackmail? N. Mexico? Was it related to Gene's past in New Mexico? Before his Hollywood fame? Izzy felt a surge of adrenaline. This was more than just a diary, it was a cry for help. A desperate attempt to leave a trail. A breadcrumb leading to the truth. The ripped page was a key. And she was determined to unlock the door it guarded. The forensics team's analysis of Gene and Betsy's phone records revealed a disturbing anomaly. A series of anonymous calls made to Gene's cell phone in the days leading up to their deaths. The calls were brief, lasting only a few seconds. And the number was untraceable. Blocked using a sophisticated masking technique. But one call, made just hours before their bodies were discovered, stood out. It lasted longer. Almost a minute. Izzy felt a jolt of excitement. This call could be the missing piece of the puzzle. She ran the number through every database. Every resource available. But it remained a ghost. A phantom connection in the digital ether. Frustrated, she decided to approach the problem from a different angle. She asked the phone company to analyze the call's signal. To pinpoint its origin. The results came back a few hours later. The call had originated from a burner phone purchased at a convenience store in Albuquerque. About an hour's drive from Santa Fe. The store's security cameras captured a blurry image of the purchaser. A man with a hooded sweatshirt pulled low over his face, making identification impossible. But Izzy noticed something else in the footage. The man was wearing a distinctive silver ring on his left hand. A ring with a skull design. A ring she had seen before. On Ricardo, the man who had been taking care of the Hackman's property. Izzy decided to visit Faye Malt at the assisted living facility where she resided. Faye, frail but still possessing a sharp mind, greeted Izzy with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "What do you want from me, detective?" she asked, her voice raspy with age. "Haven't I suffered enough?" Izzy explained her investigation, the rumors surrounding Gene's possible child, and the torn photograph. Faye listened intently, her eyes narrowed. "Gene was always a complicated man," she said, her voice filled with a mixture of affection and resentment. "He was driven, ambitious, but also deeply insecure. He craved attention, but he feared intimacy." Then, she dropped a bombshell. "He told me about the child," she said, her voice barely audible. "Years ago, after we had separated, he confessed that he had fathered a son with another woman. A woman he had met during his early days in New York." Izzy leaned forward, her heart pounding. "Did he say anything about the woman's name? The child's name?" Faye shook her head. "No, he only said that he had never acknowledged the child. That he had lived with the guilt for years. He promised me that one day, when he was old and frail, he would find them, make amends, but I don't think he ever did." The revelation confirmed Izzy's suspicions. There was a lost son. A child living in the shadows. A child who could potentially have a motive for revenge. The question now was, where was he? And how was he connected to the events at the Hackman mansion? Armed with new information, Izzy returned to the Hackman mansion, determined to uncover every secret hidden within its walls. She focused her attention on the library, a room filled with Gene's prized collection of books, movie scripts, and memorabilia. She ran her hands along the shelves, carefully examining each book, each object. Then, she noticed something unusual, a loose panel in the wall behind a bookshelf. With a surge of anticipation, she pushed the panel aside, revealing a hidden room, a small, windowless space filled with dusty boxes and forgotten memories. The room was a time capsule, a secret archive of Gene Hackman's life. She found old letters, fan mail, contracts, and photographs. And then, she saw it, a photograph of Gene Hackman holding a baby, a newborn infant wrapped in a blue blanket. Standing beside him was a woman Izzy had never seen before. A woman with dark hair and soulful eyes. The woman was not Faye Malt. Nor was she Betsy Arakawa. This was the missing piece of the puzzle. The key to unlocking the truth. Izzy took a deep breath, her mind racing. She had found the mother of Gene Hackman's lost son. Now, All she had to do was find the sun himself. The shadows within the walls were beginning to dissipate, revealing a truth far more complex and disturbing than she could have ever imagined. Izzy tracked down the woman in the photograph. A woman named Sophia, who was living a quiet, unassuming life in a small, remote town in northern New Mexico. Sophia, now in her late 70s, was initially hesitant to speak, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. But Izzy's persistence, combined with her genuine empathy, eventually broke through Sophia's defenses. Slowly, reluctantly, Sophia began to tell her story. She had met Gene Hackman in New York City in the early 1960s. When he was a struggling actor and she was a young dancer. They had fallen deeply in love, a passionate and forbidden romance that consumed them both. He was so full of life, so talented, Sophia recalled, her voice trembling with emotion. He made me feel alive, like anything was possible. But their happiness was short-lived. Gene was already married to Faye, and he couldn't bring himself to leave her. When Sophia discovered she was pregnant, Gene was torn. He wanted to be a father, but he couldn't abandon his wife and his budding career. They made a difficult decision. Sophia would raise the child on her own, and Gene would provide financial support, but he would never publicly acknowledge the boy as his son. Sophia agreed, knowing that it was the only way to protect Gene's family and his future. She raised Marco in secret, always shielding him from the truth about his father. But as Marco grew older, he began to suspect the truth. He always asked about his father, Sophia said, her voice filled with sorrow. I tried to protect him, to shield him from the pain. But he knew, he always knew. With Sophia's information, Izzy located Marco, who was working as a bartender in Albuquerque. Marco, a man in his late 50s, bore a striking resemblance to a younger Gene Hackman. The same intense eyes, the same rugged features, but his expression was hardened, his gaze filled with a simmering resentment. When Izzy confronted him about his parentage, Marco initially denied everything, but when she showed him the photograph of himself as a baby with Gene Hackman, his facade crumbled. So, you know, he said, his voice laced with bitterness. The great Gene Hackman, my father in secret, my father who never wanted me. Marco confessed that he had always known about Gene Hackman, had followed his career from afar, watching him achieve fame and fortune while he lived in poverty and obscurity. He had tried to contact Gene numerous times over the years, but his letters were always returned, unanswered. Finally, driven by desperation and a burning need for recognition, he had decided to call him, demanding money and acknowledgement. He hung up on me, Marco said, his voice trembling with anger. He told me to leave him alone, that he wanted nothing to do with me. After all these years, he still rejected me. So, yeah, I went to see him that night. I wanted to look him in the eye, to make him understand the pain he had caused me. Marco admitted that he had confronted Gene at the mansion on the night of his death. But he vehemently denied killing him or Betsy. He claimed that he had only wanted to talk, to finally have a conversation with his father. But the conversation had turned into a heated argument, filled with anger and recriminations. He had left the mansion in a rage, his heart filled with bitterness and despair. Izzy wasn't convinced. Marco had a motive, and he had been at the scene of the crime. But she had no evidence to prove that he had committed murder. She needed something more, something concrete, to connect him to the deaths of Gene Hackman and Betsy Arakawa. Izzy pieced together the events of that fateful night, the night that ended the lives of two Hollywood legends. Betsy, struggling with her loneliness and her anxieties, had turned to alcohol and prescription medication, seeking solace in a haze of oblivion. Gene, burdened by his guilt and his failing health, tried to comfort her, but his words were empty, his touch devoid of warmth. Their argument about Marco had been the final straw, a catalyst that unleashed years of pent-up resentment and pain. Betsy accused Gene of being a selfish and uncaring husband, of prioritizing his career and his secrets over her happiness. Gene, in turn, lashed out at Betsy, blaming her for his unhappiness, for his inability to escape the ghosts of his past. The argument escalated, turning into a screaming match that echoed through the mansion. In a moment of desperation, Betsy swallowed a handful of pills, her intention unclear. Was it a suicide attempt, a cry for help, or simply a reckless act of self-destruction? Whatever her intention, the pills proved fatal. Gene, Witnessing his wife's slow and agonizing death, was consumed by grief and despair. He felt responsible for her suffering, for the years of unhappiness he had caused her. In a moment of madness, he made a decision. He couldn't live without her, couldn't face the consequences of his actions. He wrote a confession, a letter to the world, revealing all his secrets and his regrets. Then, he swallowed a lethal dose of barbiturates, ending his own life. The mansion, once a sanctuary, had become a tomb, a silent witness to a double suicide fueled by secrets, guilt, and despair. Izzy found the suicide note hidden inside a first edition of The Maltese Falcon, one of Gene Hackman's favorite books. The letter, written in shaky handwriting, was a rambling confession, a desperate attempt to explain the inexplicable. I have lived a life of lies. Gene wrote, I have hurt the people I loved most. I have carried secrets that have poisoned my soul. I can no longer live with the guilt, the regret. Betsy was my anchor, my salvation. Now that she is gone, I have nothing left to live for. He confessed to his affair with Sophia, to his neglect of Marco, to the lies he had told to Faye. He admitted that he had never truly loved Betsy, that he had used her to fill a void in his heart. To escape the ghosts of his past, he revealed that he had known about Betsy's struggles with depression and addiction, but he had done nothing to help her, too consumed with his own demons. The letter was a raw, unfiltered outpouring of guilt, remorse, and self-loathing, but the most damning revelation came at the end of the letter. Gene admitted that Ricardo, the man who had been taking care of their property, had provided Betsy with the drugs she used to end her life. At her request, he had been a willing accomplice in her suicide, a silent observer of their slow and agonizing decline. Izzy realized that this was not just a double suicide, it was a carefully orchestrated tragedy. A final act of despair fueled by secrets and lies. Izzy confronted Ricardo with Gene Hackman's confession. Ricardo, initially defiant, eventually broke down under Izzy's relentless questioning. He admitted that Betsy had approached him weeks before her death, asking him to help her obtain the drugs she needed to end her life. He had initially refused, but Betsy had been persistent, pleading with him to help her escape her suffering. Ricardo claimed that he had acted out of compassion, that he had seen the despair in Betsy's eyes and couldn't bear to see her suffer any longer. He insisted that he had not known about Gene's intentions, that he had been shocked to discover their bodies. But Izzy suspected that he was hiding something, that he was more involved in the tragedy than he was letting on. Then, Ricardo revealed something that made Izzy's blood run cold. He admitted that Marco had contacted him after the deaths, threatening him, warning him not to tell the police about his involvement with Betsy. Marco had been protecting himself, trying to cover up his own role in the tragedy. With Ricardo's confession, Izzy had enough evidence to arrest Marco. Both men were charged with assisting in a suicide. Their roles in the deaths of Gene Hackman and Betsy Arakawa finally exposed. The truth, after so many years of lies and secrets, had finally come to light. Weeks later, Izzy stood before the newly erected headstones marking the final resting place of Gene Hackman and Betsy Arakawa. The storm surrounding their deaths had finally subsided. The media frenzy had died down, and the quiet town of Santa Fe was slowly returning to normal. But for Izzy, the case would forever be etched in her memory, a reminder of the destructive power of secrets and the enduring human need for love, forgiveness, and acceptance. She had learned a valuable lesson, that everyone carries burdens, that even the brightest stars can be consumed by darkness. She whispered a silent prayer for Gene and Betsy, hoping that they had finally found peace, that they were no longer haunted by the ghosts of their past. As she turned to leave the cemetery, she noticed Marco standing near the gate, his eyes filled with a mixture of remorse and regret. He approached her, his expression contrite. "I just wanted to say thank you, Detective," he said, his voice barely audible, "for uncovering the truth, for giving me a chance to finally know my father, even if it was too late." Izzy nodded, offering him a small smile. "It's never too late for forgiveness, Marco," she said, "not for yourself, and not for others." As Izzy walked away, she felt a sense of closure, a sense that justice had been served. The case had been a difficult and emotionally draining one, but it had also been a journey of discovery, a journey that had revealed the complexities of human nature and the enduring power of the human spirit. The sun was setting, painting the sky with hues of orange and gold, a promise of a new dawn, a new beginning. The darkness had lifted, and the truth had finally set them free.